It's okay, we're all ready? It's been a while. Nice to get back to normal. So welcome to term 4. It's the final Bina term for the year, a short term, but hopefully a packed term with lots of good stuff. So, just a bit of background to the topic which we're going to do. Just a bit of background. I wanted to do something based on a recently published book which I came across a few months ago. It was put out by a colleague, actually, who I don't know very well, meaning he's one of the Chabad rabbis in America. But it turns out that we share a relative, and I met him at my nephew's bar mitzvah a few months ago. And I chatted, we chatted, I knew he was planning on a book, and I sort of got talking to him, and he got talking to me about what we do. And what came out was interesting. He does very similar stuff to what we're doing, meaning a large part of his teaching surrounds the area of personal growth using Jewish wisdom. Very, very similar to, in a different way, but very similar to what we're doing. And as we were talking, he had just published a book. It's this book. It's called It's Within You. Very good. A detailed roadmap to igniting deeper self-worth, richer relationships, and greater personal freedom. And it's by him. His name is Rabbi Aryeh Weinstein. That's the book. And he did it together with a therapist called Ilene Cohen. And as I read it, it's a very good read, and it covers some critical issues of personal growth. Many of them are things that we've discussed often and done quite extensively, but everyone brings about it a different way with different examples. So it was quite interesting to see someone else doing very, very similar stuff in a different way. So I thought that we'd revisit some of these issues and base it on the book and use some of the examples, some of the concepts, and go into them that he's brought, because these things, especially the critical components of personal growth, from a Jewish perspective, are things that we need to keep on revisiting, because we never master them. We absorb them, hopefully, and we learn from them, and we have them impact on ourselves and on our growth in some positive way, in positive direction, but we never master them, and we need to keep on getting reminded and keep on revisiting the concepts. Okay, so what I want to do is, I'm going to give you an exercise to do. Okay? But before we do that, essentially the crux of the book really is something that we've talked about very often, which we're going to go into again from a different angle a bit. It's about, do we live life from the outside, in other words, outside in, from without, or do we live it inside out from within? Right? And a lot of that has to do with how we define our own worthiness and our own value. So that's the concept. We're going to create a model today and a definition, and then go into it and see how it extrapolates over the next coming weeks. But I'm going to give you an exercise. I'm going to ask you to be brutally honest. Now, you won't have to repeat your answers. You won't have to tell anyone your answers. But just between you and God, you know what I'm saying? Be honest, okay? So on the other side of your handout, I hope. Is it there? Yeah. Okay. There's pens here for those that want. Yes. No, yes. It should be there. The Chama should have them. Yeah, thanks. Okay, let me tell you what to do. It's very simple. Just go through each one. You don't have to hand them in, by the way. It's just for you to keep. No. I just grabbed them. What you need to do is run through this, and next to each one put T or F, true or false. I'll give you a couple of minutes and fill it in. Hey, no, paper. There should be more there. You have extra papers? Yeah? Oh. I said, no, let's bring a few. Sorry, Nechama, we bring a few papers. Handouts, please. I think some of them are missing for some reason. Anyone has handouts? Handouts? Yep. There we go. There's some people's walking in. Okay, so it's just an exercise. Try to be honest. Just put true or false. You won't have to give it to anyone. You won't have to admit it to anyone. Just true or false. Give you a couple of minutes. Can't think too much. You have to just be honest and answer the question. Give you 5 minutes to do it. There's a pen. Where are the box of pens? Oh, here we are.
Yes,
So we go 1 minute. Sorry? No, maybe. True or false? Okay. So this little test was developed by the co-author of the book, Ilene Cohen. And it's really about testing ourselves. As I said, you don't have to give it to anyone. Just keep it yourself. I mean, I can't say I'm not curious and inquisitive, so no one will. I'll be honest. But I won't, I promise. So it's really to test sort of ourselves of where we get a sense of self-worth from. So I'll tell you what she said in terms of the scoring, okay? And you can do whatever you want with it, but then we'll go to the topic. So she says, if you had between 16 and 22, in other words, between 16 and 22 are truths, then you know you're a person who gets their sense of worthiness from without, completely, right? Which is a problem because that creates challenges, it makes it difficult to find real purpose, it could affect relationships, and it's time to start making changes. She says if you get between 10 and 15, then sometimes your worthiness comes from within and sometimes with that. In other words, it's not a clear-cut thing. Sometimes we have a sense of self-worth from within, sometimes we get it from without, but we still have work to do. Between 5 and 9, she says you're probably maintaining some good relationships, your life hasn't been significantly affected by a feeling of lack internal worthiness, but it's still progress. And 4 or less means you've got a strong sense of worthiness that comes from within, but it wouldn't hurt to identify when you do seek approval from the outside so it doesn't progress. Okay. So maybe we should take the test towards the end because then you'll see if you were truthful or not. Okay. Okay. Everyone ready? Yes. Now the good news is, like everything in personal growth, the good news is that it's a work in progress. She says about herself that when she took this test before she started doing work in this area, her score was close to 22. Interesting, Rabbi Twersky, I've mentioned this to you many times, talks about this himself. Rabbi Twersky has written over 25 books, largely on the topic of self-esteem. And you'd think he's a person with perfect self-esteem. He was a person that struggled with self-esteem. Now, struggling with self-esteem and self-worthiness doesn't mean you're not functional, doesn't mean you don't have success. You can be tremendously successful and still be a very, very insecure person, right? So, and he identified within himself that was very, very true. In fact, just a little story I once heard from him when he was here. He said he once gave a lecture, and most of his lectures are very, very good. And then there was a feedback sheet, anonymous feedback sheet that was given out. It was over 100 people. 99 of them came back with raving reports how wonderful the lecture was, and one of them was very, very critical and said how bad it was. And on the way home, all he could think about was that what did he find wrong? What was the problem? And how dare he, or whatever the case was, right? And it's an amazing thing. I mean, you'd imagine the score of 99 out of 100 is not bad. If you can impress an audience 99%, that's fantastic. And yet that kind of bothered him. And it was those stories like that he identified within himself that he had a problem. It was with him really, in terms of how he identifies his own self-worth and self-value, right? So she said that she said that growing up, she discovered that she had a certain way of dealing with life, which she thought it would help her through tough times, but then realized that it was really all wrong, and she had to make changes. So the first thing really to examine is just generally when we have challenges or we have issues, right? What do we look at? Do we look at symptoms or do we look at the cause? This is the really, really crux of the issue. Because there are many, many areas in relationships, in the way we live, in the way we function, the way we achieve, that we can look at and we can try and make changes. And symptoms is a good thing to address as well, but when you only address symptoms, you never get to the root cause of what and why something is happening, right? So a couple of examples. The example he gives, for example, is if someone is crying. So crying means, the symptom of crying is that something wrong with the eyes. Tears are coming from the eyes. Now, that could be the cause. I mean, if you cut up an onion, that's what happens, right? If you cut up an onion, then crying is it's a problem with your eyes. Most times when people cry, it's got nothing to do with their eyes. It's got to do with something internal, which is being manifested and expressed through the concept of tears, right? That's just a very extreme example. So when you go deeper, we find that pain or discomfort or challenge comes from a need that we have. It's very rarely from what's happening, from the experience and the symptom. It comes from a deeper need, and we need to try and explore what that need is and how we deal with that need. When we were in yeshiva, we used to be taught in fact, it was normally addressed around the time of Elul, before Rosh Hashanah, and our mentors, our teachers used to talk about the concept of tshuva, and they would talk about the concept of change. And they used to say that sometimes change means they didn't use these words, but what they meant was like a paradigm shift, a fundamental shift. And at a Farbrengen, with a bit of the Chaim, they would give the following mashal, the following analogy. And they would say there was a chicken that fell into sand, fell into dirt. And someone had a chicken in his backyard, and the chicken was very, very dirty. And the guy who owned the chicken didn't like it, so he decided he needs to clean the chicken. So painstakingly he started cleaning feather by feather, and it was taking hours. Chickens have a lot of feathers. Each feather to wipe off the sand, to wipe off the dirt. And then while in the middle of it, he was doing this, there was something came by and sort of, touched the chicken and tickled the chicken, and the chicken gave a shake. And as the chicken gave a shake, everything fell off, right? And it was fine. So he used to tell us that sometimes you got to give one big shocker. It's not about dealing with each symptom individually. Sometimes you got to go deeper. You got to deal with symptoms too, and each symptomatic experience has its own strategies and its own set of values and its own issues that we have to address. But often when we try to progress in life, or we try to sort of fundamentally change, a fundamental shocker is sometimes a lot more effective, right? But it's harder. It's harder, but much more effective. The analogy he gives in the book is he says, imagine a manager of a warehouse that gets a delivery of 30 boxes, and the boxes were piled up high into a pallet and left on the outside. Now the manager has to get them into the warehouse. So there's two ways of doing that. He can very, very slowly pick up each box and carry it in. That'll take a long time. Probably pretty secure way of doing things, box at a time. Or he can get a forklift, and a forklift is expensive, it's hard, but a forklift will pick up the whole thing and pick it inside. So that's sort of a fundamental change, same sort of idea. So often we know as people, what are the things that we look for? What are the things that we need? So everyone is looking for happiness, right? Everyone wants to be happy. It's fair to say that although most of us are fairly stressed a lot of the time, but we're all looking to de-stress. We're all looking to be calm. We're all looking for stability, for security. And yet, very, very often, as much as people will say they're looking for happiness and inner calmness and stability, they don't have it. Right? If they look at themselves really truthfully and take a good, honest, hard look at themselves, they will notice that they don't really achieve happiness. They don't feel really happy. And they don't feel calm. Right? And often what happens is, and this is really the fundamental point of this whole thing, which is something we've talked about many, many times, often what people do is they hang it on certain causes. If only I had that job. I'm really stressed because my job is not working out. If only I had this. If only this would work out in a certain way. If only my kid would behave in a certain way. And so on and so forth, right? And it never works. Why? Because there's only one thing that needs to change, as we've spoken about so many times, and that's us. We need to change. Change from within, right? And the good news is, as we've talked about many times, that when we change ourselves, everything else starts to change as well, right? Because when we start living from within, everything else looks differently, right? I tell the story about someone was looked out and saw the laundry that the neighbor kept on hanging up. And the woman talks to the husband and says, it's I don't know what's wrong with these people. They need a new washing machine. Laundry, every time they hang it up, I notice that it's dirty. And she kept on saying this for months on end, until one day she got a window cleaner in the house to clean the windows. And suddenly the neighbor's laundry was all clean. Right? So that's exactly what it is, right? It's the way we look at the world. We cannot, as we know, we've said it in so many different ways and so many different times, we cannot change what happens around us. Right? This is Stephen Covey's thing, this is Viktor Frankl's philosophy, and this is Jewish philosophy. HaKol b'yedei Shemayim. Everything is divine providence, everything happens for a reason, everything happens by divine instruction and divine plan. But we can change ourselves. And when we change ourselves, suddenly everything looks different. So it's not just that we have to change ourselves, which is the most difficult thing to do actually. It's when we change ourselves, other things do change. Right? And that's the point. But we have to kind of define and understand what that means to change from within. Oh, I totally forgot my PowerPoint presentation. There we are. I'll check it. So this is what I wanted to show you. You know that in Hebrew, often words mean different things. So what's the word for a face? Panim. But the word panim also comes to the word pnimiyut. Pnimiyut means the inside, right? Pnimi means inside, internal. And we know that most people, unless they put on a real show, the pnimiyut of a person, the reason why a face is called panim, is because the pnimiyut of a person, the inside of a person, the internal of a person comes out on the face. There's many phrases like in the Talmud and different verses that say that. Chachmat Adam Ta'ir Panav. So when a person has really discovered an amazing piece of wisdom, the face shines. Very often you can look at a person and you can tell their character, you can tell if they're happy or they're not happy, right? The goal in life is that our inside changes to the point where what is visible on the panim, what is visible on the face, fits in with what's going on inside in a synchronized way, in a good way, and that's how we achieve calmness. But it starts from within and then it comes out on the panim. Right? Now, we need to make something very clear. When we talk about changing ourselves, which is really the point of the foundation of this whole concept. We talk about changing ourselves, we don't mean to stop blaming other things and other people and start blaming ourselves. Right? Because just as blaming others is destructive, blaming ourselves is also destructive. It's not about blame. Blame is a bad thing, no matter if you're blaming something else, someone else, or you're blaming yourself. Right? Blame is always a destructive, because even if you blame yourself, blaming is always an escape. That's what blaming is. It's a way to escape. You hinge it on something else. If I blame myself, I just say the same thing. Oh, I'm just a stupid person. I'm so careless. I'm so irresponsible. Right? And therefore, and so you're responsible, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. I'm just an irresponsible person. Right? So blaming yourself just means that you create an identity for yourself which is fitting in with the problem, with the challenge, and that's not change. Right? Nor is it taking responsibility. So taking responsibility and blaming is two fundamentally different things, completely different things. Right? Take responsibility, yes. Blaming, no. In other words, blaming is a negative thing. Blaming is a destructive thing. Take responsibility is a good thing. Why is that? Because the point is, before we develop it a bit further, the point is a point we've made many times. The point of this whole exercise, this whole concept, is that change means living within. And living within means, this is the definition, right? Living within means to acknowledge the intrinsic and internal worth and value that we all have by just being created, by just existing, right? Not by what we've achieved or accomplished, but at the very fact that we exist. Okay? And that value, self-worth, which everyone needs and wants self-worth, that self-worth is defined by that intrinsic value which we have, and not by outside experiences. Right? So in other words, that was the exercise you did before. Most human beings, most of us, at least on some level, define our worthiness, define the self-worth that we have by things that happen on the outside. Approval from others, achievement on the outside, success on the outside. Right? All sorts of a range of external things, including sometimes the externalities that exist within ourselves. We also have pnim and chutz. We also have inside and outside within ourselves. In other words, in the inside, there's an inside and an outside, right? Inside is the core essence of just existing, what we refer to often as the core essence of the neshama, of the soul. And we have our externalities, which is all the layers of our existence, the layers of our functionality, right? So when we seek to define or to create or to describe our own self-worth by things that happen on the outside, whether the outside on a distant way or the outside within ourselves, that's living from without. When we define and acknowledge deep down and we discover and we connect to the deep down inner worth that we all have at the very essence of who we are, just by the very fact that we have that spark, we have that soul, that's living inside out. Okay? And when we can do that, it's an amazing shift, because amazing things can happen, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Now, what we also have to remember is this. This is just a part of the book that he brings in. I think it's an important point that he makes. That he says that changing within is not just better for ourselves, but changing within is better for others. Meaning when we change, our relationship with others is so much better. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that relationships are complicated things. Relationships are two-way streets. Sometimes others do need to shift a little bit as well, but the chances of changing others is so much more when we change ourselves, right? Tells a bit of a funny story in the book, and I'm not suggesting that in every case this would work, but nevertheless it brings up the point, right? He says he read a book, it was a blog post actually, but it was titled "How I Saved My Marriage" by a guy called Richard Paul Evans. And he talked about how his marriage was in deep trouble, right? And he said just him and his wife were both very, very good people, but kept on clashing. They were both decent people, both good human beings, but they just completely clashed all the time, right? And he says as time passed, each of them became more and more defensive and put up more walls, and to the point where they started to discuss separation and divorce. And he says one time he was on a tour. I think he was a music person. He was on a tour. And over the phone, him and his wife had a big fight, and he reached his limit. He said he broke down, taking a shower, and he couldn't just understand why two good people, and he acknowledged they were both good people, they weren't fundamentally flawed. Often that is the case. Relationships are not always, but often that is the case with just two good people who just can't. And he just asked himself, why did I marry someone so different to me? Why won't she change? And then he says from somewhere deep inside an idea came to him, and he asked himself, why don't I change? Like maybe I can't change her, but I can change myself, right? So he came back home. It's a funny story. He came back home, and he was met with a very, very ice cold wife. And lying in bed at night, he had an inspirational idea. When he woke up in the morning, he turns to his wife and he says to her, "How can I make your day better?" Now you can imagine in that context, he wouldn't have got a good response, and he expected that, right? And all she says is, "You can't," angrily, right? And then she says, "Why are you asking?" So he said, "Because I mean it." So obviously he expected it to go all kinds of different ways, right? So he says, I mean it. I just want to know what I can do to make your day better. So she paused for a moment. She says, you want to do something? Go clean the kitchen. And he did. And he got up and he went and cleaned the kitchen. It was all good. Next morning he wakes up and does the same thing, right? He says to her, how can I make your day better? So she obviously, she didn't know what happened all of a sudden. So she was still in that mood. She says to him, clean the garage. And he said he didn't have time to do it, but he did it anyways, right? And then on the third day, he did the same thing. And she got very, very flustered and said, nothing, you can't do anything, please stop asking. Right? It was like almost... And he said, I'm sorry, I can't. She says, why are you doing this? He says, because I care about you and I care about the marriage. Right? So he did it every way for 2 weeks. Towards the end of the second week, he asked his usual question, he woke up in the morning, and she breaks down crying and she says, I should be asking you this question. And he said, you should, but not now. Right now, I need to be the one to change. You need to know how much you mean to me. And he says, like the walls of Jericho, the walls came tumbling down. Suddenly, two good people, never thought they would have a peaceful relationship, started to experience true depth of what marriage is, right? Now, in other words, as I said, relationships are complicated things. Not every relationship works like that. Not sometimes there's fundamental flaws other people have, and so on and so forth. But the point is very clear, and the point is very relevant. That change doesn't just help the way we look at the world, but change actually writes the reality often on the outside world. And very, very often, internal change definitely has an impact and influences other people and enhances relationships as well. Okay, so that's the power of change. As I've told you the story many, many times about the Kotzker Rebbe. The Kotzker Rebbe said that when he was young, he thought he would change the world, and he thought he would change his community, and his neighborhood, and his street, and his family, and then he decided he'll change himself, right? But as I've shared with you before, the depth of that story is that it's not that simple, because what do you mean he's going to change himself? He was a leader, he was a great Rebbe, he was a Hasidic rabbi, he was in charge of inspiring many, many, many people. But I think what he was saying was, he wasn't abdicating the responsibility of being a leader, he wasn't abdicating the responsibility of inspiring and guiding and directing other people. What he was trying to say to himself, that if I change, that's the best way to change others. That's the best way to lead. That's the best way to give an example. That's the best way to create a culture around me that people want to follow in the values that I'm communicating and I'm imparting. Okay. So what does all this mean? So again, let's go back to this concept of the fundamental sense of worthiness, right? Everyone is desperate. Everyone has a basic need to feel valued. I mean, that's just a basic concept. No one wants to feel not valued. Everyone needs to feel valued. Everyone needs to feel they're deserving, they're lovable, and so on. Right? So that's not a bad thing. Why is it not a bad thing? Because being valued breeds success. When a person feels valued, they want to do, they want to grow, they want to, right? If we thought we weren't indispensable, if we thought we're just one of many, then God didn't need to make us, right? The very, very fact that God made us means that He wants, I wouldn't say needs, but He wants us, right? There's a purpose for each individual to be more. The Torah tells us that Adam nivra yechidi. When God created the world, He created animals in pairs, but He created a human being one at a time, right? Adam and then Chava. Why? Says the Talmud, why was the human being created yechidi? Why was a person created as a singular person? To teach us that every person is an olam maleh. Every person is a complete world. Every person is indispensable. Everyone can impact the world, right? So we all need this. We all need to feel this. We all need to feel that sense of worthiness. The only thing is, the question is, where does that sense of worthiness come in? How does it create it, right? So the way it works is like this. It can be created without or within. Without means that we confirm our worthiness from outside sources, like people, things, and circumstances, right? Or within means we confirm our worthiness by knowing that we were intentionally created by God. The very fact that we exist means we have an intrinsic value. Now here comes the depth of this whole thing. If we take the first model, that our worthiness comes from outside, what does that breed? Right? What that means is that the outside world is defining our sense of worth, right? That breeds arrogance. It breeds self-centeredness, egocentricity. Why? Because it breeds an incredible sense of insecurity. if I have to depend on everyone and everything all the time for my own intrinsic value, that creates an incredibly insecure person. And insecure people are generally very self-absorbed, right? In other words, it's interesting. What happens is, it's almost counterintuitive. What people think is normally the opposite, right? Having an unhealthy sense of self-worth, meaning not feeling intrinsically self-valued, not understanding my true, infinite, unconditional and unbreakable sense of worth, makes me more self-absorbed. In other words, that insecurity breeds self-absorption, because I'm always fighting for that worthiness. Again, worthiness, feeling a sense of worthiness is a need. It's a human need. Everyone needs to. In fact, it's an important need. But if the script is written by the outside, then I'm going to be totally focused on it. My whole focus will be on how is the outside affecting my sense of worthiness. Because if the outside goes wrong, then who I am becomes wrong. If the outside goes wrong, then my sense of value becomes wrong. And that becomes disastrous. So therefore, I'm totally focused on the outside, but I'm actually totally absorbed in myself. Does that make sense? Right. However, the opposite is also true. If my sense of worthiness comes within means my intrinsic value, my soul, the fact that I am unconditionally, no matter what happens and what I do, and what I accomplish or what I don't accomplish, or what I succeed or what I fail, I always possess at the depth and core of my existence self-value, then I'm secure. If I'm secure, I don't need to be self-absorbed in myself. So in other words, living within, understanding my true self-value, actually allows me to go, understanding the real importance, the real infinite self, allows me to go beyond myself. Allows me not to take myself so seriously. And most times, particularly in relationships, not most times, many times, right? In work relationships, in the way people get on, in the way people do things together, things start to derail when people take themselves too seriously. And people stand on ceremonies. People take themselves too seriously. You did this, I did this, but you didn't do that. It's all about I, right? When people take themselves too seriously, that's when everything starts to... Now, it doesn't mean we should become a doormat, right? We all have needs, we all need to be respected, we need to respect others, be respected, and so on and so forth. We need to stand our ground, we need to... Yeah, that's true. Self-care and so on. Because today, by the way, there's a lot spoken about self-care. There's a lot of focus today about taking care of yourself. And taking care of yourself is a good thing, but not when it comes from a sense of being self-absorbed. It's a good thing because in order to accomplish, I need to make sure I'm healthy. Emotionally, physically, spiritually, and so on. Right? But when it comes to a point of being self-absorbed, people talk about me time and me, and there's a lot of me going on in today's world, right? And I haven't found that the people who talk about me are that much happier necessarily. In fact, I find they're a lot more empty, right? Because the other difference between living within and living without is that living without breeds emptiness. Because it's not my life can't be about purpose. I'm too busy fighting all day to protect my sense of self-worth. It's all about what people are thinking about. It's all about continuously struggling and fighting to maintain and to preserve that sense of self-worth, because I've got to make sure that the outside pieces are all in right position. The impressions I make on others, the way people think about me, the way people talk about me, and so on, it's all about me. So therefore I don't have time for meaning and purpose, because I'm so self-absorbed trying to fight for my own self-worth. Right? I'm talking about this in extremes. The truth is not in extremes. We all have a bit of both, right? And we just have to examine that. But when I live a life from within, so I'm secure with myself, I'm secure with my internal value, I'm secure with my neshama, I'm secure with who I am, then I've got time to work, to take responsibility, to live a life of meaning, to actually look for purpose, to look for giving, to look to help others, to look for spirituality, to look for things outside of me which are valuable, because I don't have to spend the whole day focusing on myself. I take myself less seriously. I don't get so, as I say in Yiddish, tzachisht. I don't get so affected when someone looks at me the wrong way, or when someone didn't quite repay the favor exactly the way I thought they would, or that kind of thing. Because I'm okay. I don't define my worth by them. I don't define my intrinsic worth by them. My worthiness, my sense of value is there. It's a God-given intrinsic thing. If I think the other person did the wrong thing, when the time comes and when it's an opportunity presents itself in a productive, effective, constructive way, I'll talk to them about it. But it's not like, it's not like I'm fighting for it the whole time. So I can take myself less seriously. I can be less self-absorbed, and therefore I can lead into a life of purpose. Right? It's very easy to say all this, but it's worth remembering all the time, because it's actually quite a hard thing. Because the default disposition of most human beings is not this. This is the problem, right? So really, how we define ourselves becomes a choice, right? Becomes a choice between emptiness versus purpose, between insecurity versus security, and between stress and being calm. At the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. Most stress, not all stress, most stress comes from within. I just met with someone the other day who came and was asking me to help them out with stress. And they had a lot of different moving parts in their life that was causing stress. And if you look superficially, we could look at the symptoms and go through each one and say, well, maybe you should handle it this way. And a lot of them do need different strategy. But I paused and I looked at the person and I gave them a sort of a perspective, and I showed that individual how most of the stress was actually coming about how he felt about himself. It was like a light bulb. Obviously, it's easy to tell someone else this, right? That's, have a good job. I can tell other people this. The challenge is telling myself, but that's a separate story. Okay, that's my self-worth. But it's amazing when someone can realize that it's an amazing thing. And I showed him one point of how he was viewing himself that was actually leading into all the different components of stress. All those different experiences of stress seemed very different on the surface. They were different symptoms, but they were coming from one cause. Because when we define our self-worth by what's happening outside of us, and we know, even though we try to control what's happening outside of us, we know ultimately we don't have control. It's huge stress, right? It's huge stress when you think you're late for an appointment, what someone's going to think of you. It's huge stress how you get up and talk. Will they say it was good? It's huge stress how they look at your house. Will they think you're competent or incompetent? It's all stressful. So the whole day, the stress is unbelievable. And then it's conflicting stresses and conflicting things, and it becomes a big mishmash, right? If my starting point is within, knowing who I am, not know I am that I can go to sleep now, knowing who I am, on the contrary, that I can get to work and start taking responsibility and build up meaning and purpose by doing good things in my life and constructive things. But the starting point is that my foundation is my self-worth and my intrinsic value. That cuts out 95% of the stress. It comes from a sense of calmness. It's very liberating if we can only get there a little bit. Right? Part of this is the belief in that internal spark, right? Why? Because part of it is focusing inwards to understand what we were given, to understand what actually happened when we were born, right? So this is this week's parsha, coincidentally, or there's no such thing as coincidence, obviously, but right. This week's parsha begins with the words Lech Lecha, right? Where God tells Abraham, Lech Lecha, go. He gives him a test of leaving his birthplace and his father's house and his environment and going to Israel, right? But the famous question all the commentaries ask is, we did it on Tuesday, is the expression Lech Lecha is very weird. In Hebrew, Lech Lecha means go to you, right? What does it mean, go to you? Right? So some say go for your own sake. Okay, that's one idea. There's a cute idea, I'll just share it with you. I said it on Tuesday, that God was hinting to him that he would eventually have a child. This is the guy who goes to Israel, they have a child because the numerical value of the two words Lech Lecha is 100. And Abraham was 100 when he gave birth to a child, so God was saying, Lech Lecha, when you're 100, you'll have a child, and so on, right? But it all still doesn't fit in with the words, right? So the commentaries and the Kabbalists explain, and the particular passage I was focusing on this week came from Hasidic rabbi called the Ishbitzer, and he says, what God was revealing to Abraham, which perhaps Abraham wasn't completely aware of before, was his inner essential soul. He says, Lech lecha, you need to go and connect with who you are, who you really are. Go to yourself, right? But there's a condition, which is before I take the condition, which is go to yourself is the spiritual meaning of going to Israel. Israel is like the core epicenter of the world. We all have an Israel within us. That's that point of the neshama, right? So Lech Lecha, God's saying, go to that land I'm going to show you. Go to the soul. Go to acknowledge, become someone who understands and acknowledges and connects and discovers that inner essence of who you are, that soul that I'm giving you, or that I gave you, that soul that you were created with, the soul by the very fact that the very essence of your life, you were created as a baby with purity before you started to accomplish anything. The very fact you were born means I want you to exist. You have a purpose, you have a meaning, you have a unique purpose, in fact, that no one else has, right? Which is an amazing, liberating thing, but it's an empowering thing, by the way. This is one of the things that the Talmud says, right? The Talmud says that a person is supposed to say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam. The world was created for me. Now some people take it literally, but right? And it's meant the complete opposite. It's not about I'm self-absorbed and everyone's here to serve me. It's the contrary. I'm here to serve the world. That's what it means, because I can contribute to the world. I can achieve a purpose. I can breed meaning that no one else can. What's the proof? What's the proof that I have a mission that none of you can do? The fact that I was created in addition to you. That's it. Very simple. If what I need to contribute to the world is what 10 other people can do, I'm superfluous. I'm redundant. Right? It's a simple concept, but it's very apparent, right? So God says, Lech Lecha, you got to go and discover that. And discover your intrinsic value, your unique value, your pure value, your eternal value. But, says Hashem, in order to do that, you got to make some sacrifices. You got to switch direction. Lech lecha ma'atzcha, go away from your environment, even from what you used to, from your parents' home, from your influences. Move away from everything that is influencing you from the outside. Not that all of them are bad, right? That's important. But they're bad because you're defining yourselves by them. So go away from them, and then you can work from within out. Right? So we all need to do the Lech Lecha. We need to go towards ourselves. We need to go and discover that internal value. But in order to do that, we've got to redirect. We've got to switch around our whole direction of living. It's a very hard thing to do. It's something we have to think about again and again and again, because by nature, if we walk out the door and someone says something to us we don't like, right? Because that's the way we wire. That's the ego. We all have an ego. And that's okay. It's there for us to work at it. It's the reminder of ourselves that our intrinsic value is who we are. And everything comes from that. And we're not defined or worthy or valuable to do with anything from the outside, anything external, including the external within us. Because even Abraham, as the Ishbitzer Rebbe says, his external wasn't just external. His external was his own thinking, and his own thinking was good. His own thinking was logical. He was the only human being at the time that logically arrived at the conclusion of monotheistic belief. And God says you should go away from that, because the Kabbalists explain that when God said go away from the house of your father, it doesn't only mean his physical father. We know the term father and mother in Kabbalah means chokhmah and binah, your thinking. Why? Because even if you define yourself by your thinking, that's not good. Because even our thinking is an important tool, it's a critical tool. It's a tool that we use every single day, and we use it to make choices and good values and decisions. But we don't define ourselves by our thinking, because our thinking is still part of our external. So move away from your emotions, from your feeling. You've got a set of emotions, you've got a set of cognitive tools, you've got a personality. All of that is true. Some of it is very good, some of it maybe you have to chuck away. That's all good, but you've got to work with it. But that's not you. As we talked about the garment theory a lot in the past. It's not you. Lech lecha, go to you, discover your soul. Discover who you really are, your sense of intrinsic worthiness. But in order to do that, you've got to move away from defining yourselves from bet avicha, from artzecha, from your environment, from your cognition, from your emotions, from anything that's on the external. Right? And then you discover that change within means that no matter what the external circumstances are, no matter what happens, the core sense of self is never lost. Because that spark of internal worthiness is eternal. It never changes. It's unconditional. We're born with it. We might mess up on the outside, for which we have to take responsibility. That's fine. We can always reconnect. But the spark of internal worthiness is never lost. Never goes away. If we define ourselves from the outside in, the outside completely changes all the time. But that sense of, even the externalities of our own environment changes. We have good days and bad days, good moods and bad moods. We develop our cognitive abilities, better, worse, whatever the case is. But one thing that's a constant is that internal worthiness. Right? And when we discover that internal worthiness, this is the paradox. Not really a paradox, but this is the greatness of this whole concept. When we discover who we are, then we can go beyond who we are. Then we can grow. Because when we discover who we really are, then we're not limited by anything else. We're not limited by circumstances. We're not limited by the externalities that sometimes stand in the way. When we discover who we intrinsically are, then we can go beyond who we perceive we are. That's what I really meant. Right? And that's where real growth takes place. That's when we look at the world differently, we become a lot more positive, become a lot more calm, and it gives us the ability to really go beyond who we think we are. Because that sense of internal intrinsic value is exactly that. It's eternal. It's eternal and it's infinite. However, just to end off, if that is true, the real way, and this group is personal growth using Jewish ideas, right? So the real way to do that is, it's very hard to do that without a sense of God. That's the truth. Although this is literature that's spoken about in all different types of contexts, but the truth is, without really understanding, without really bringing in God into our life, it's actually a very difficult thing to understand this. Why? Because everything that is created, right? I'm sharing with you an idea that's brought down in Jewish thinking, Jewish literature. There's a creator and created, right? Everything that's created is dependent, correct? We are created, so we depend on God keeping us alive, right? Anything that's dependent on something else is never properly reliable, correct? Because it changes. Nothing is truly infinite and constant if it's dependent on something else. In other words, anything that's dependent on something else can never be truly eternal because it's always at the subservient to the will and the desire of the one that is dependent on. Correct? Therefore, when we talk about a person's eternal value, we're talking about a person's intrinsic worth, and that intrinsic worth being a spark of purity and a spark of internal value, which never changes and can never be damaged and never be corrupted. The only way to really understand that is that it's the depth and the spark of our neshama, which is godliness, which is an infusion of godliness. And it's an infusion of godliness, that's why it's constant. That's why it's always pure. That's why it's uncorruptible. That's why it's infinite. And that's why it gives us the ability to grow in an amazing way. But its eternity is because it's godly. Right? And therefore this process and this journey for discovering ourselves and working through the world from within, going outwards, is much more enhanced when we invite godliness into the equation. Because that gives us a deep insight and a deep understanding of how that intrinsic value actually works. Not only how it works, but then how it's actualized and how it's revealed and how it's manifested. And as we've talked about before, from what Viktor Frankl says, that intrinsic value, the only way it can be manifested is through meaning and purpose. And meaning and purpose, from a Jewish point of view, is guided and inspired by the values that God teaches us through His Torah. Right? So I just wanted to add that because that sort of completes the idea. That gives a bit of an understanding of how that internal value that we have is actually eternal and uncorruptible. So that's the foundation of this thinking, and what we're going to do in the next few weeks is we're going to see how this goes and how this works in all different parts of our life, and how there's one core essence, not you looking at the symptom, but looking at the foundation of how it affects all the other symptoms in interesting ways. Have a wonderful week.